No slides. No slides, guys. So anyway, James, just like you, very impressive presentation, Dr. Ghosh, on how we need to secure every part of the system for resilience. Very visually evocative presentation. Thank you so much, Carl, for on the theme of water, and James, thank you so much for highlighting coastal protection. So important for Asia. So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the role of insurance in adaptation and resilience. Let me start with a real life example. So, Asia is the world's most natural disaster prone region. And within Asia, is anyone here from Philippines? Yeah, so you know that Philippines on average faces 20 typhoons per year. That is all getting exacerbated as a result of climate change. Philippines also employs one third of its workforce as agricultural workers. And over the last decade, over $5 billion of losses have been incurred to agricultural farmlands and crops as a result of typhoons and droughts, wiping out incomes of thousands of farmers. And then in 2017, IFC came together with a microfinance institution and a group of insurers in order to launch typhoon insurance for rice and corn farmers. The result, when the next storm struck, it didn't just rebuild farms, it restored hope and contributed to food security for the Philippines. And that's the power of insurance. It's not just about protection, it's truly about recovery and rebuilding. And think about it, insurance has played that role throughout history, whether it was de risking maritime trade that fostered global commerce or underwriting risk for steam power and electrification. Insurance has been a part of major technological and industrial transitions, and it can play a similar role for the greatest transition that we are going through, which is climate transition. But we have two challenges in Asia. One, Asia doesn't have enough insurance. So, of the total $65 billion of losses incurred as a result of direct impact of natural hazards, in 2023, only 9% of the losses were insured. Number two, the traditional risk models of insurers are facing uncertainties in the face of elevated climate impacts. Eric is here. He knows that as a result of California wildfires and Australian floods, you might have read that a lot of insurers have had to withdraw insurance in the face of unanticipated losses or raise premiums, thereby making insurance unaffordable. So this double whammy, unavailable insurance, unaffordable insurance, can put a strain on government finances. It can also make the availability of other financial services unviable. So what's the path forward? Well, the actors within the insurance ecosystem need to work individually and collectively to focus on four priorities. And I'm going to call that four P's. So the P1 is prepare better. And we heard that actually in the plenary today. We need to be using data and analytics tools and platforms in order to be able to more accurately assess risks. And you said it needs to be localized, right? And that can, and by integrating that into pricing, you can expand more coverage. Number two, promote more insurance, not just catastrophe, but life, health, agriculture, which is all going to get impacted by climate through encouraging financial literacy and policy, and coupling that with risk reduction measures by policyholders through climate education and through market signals. Number three, we need to prevent market failure through new forms of risk transfer, risk pooling, partnerships, but also innovations such as parametric insurance, which is a type of insurance that gets triggered when a certain level of weather condition occurs, such as wind speed or rainfall. And finally, provide financing, which we hear a lot of on climate adaptation and mitigation, where insurers can play uh, multiple roles. One as risk carriers to de risk investments in transition, as institutional investors to deploy capital into green investments and net zero commitments like AIA has done, and also through partnerships such as FAST-P, which is the blended finance initiative of which AIA is a part. So, in summary, insurers with their deep understanding of risk and with their financial firepower can be pivotal to elevating the scale and speed that we need of climate action. And we are all here today in the room because we have a stake in the sustainable future for Asia and the world. Let's use the energy in the room in order to put a spotlight on insurance to protect Asia or as we say at AIA, for the healthier, longer, and better lives for the communities that we serve. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to be moderating um, a Q&A, and I've got a lot of questions that have come in. But before I go with the audience questions, I'm gonna, have a couple to start with a couple of questions of my own. And so, Arunabha, Carl, you're visiting Singapore. You would know about Singapore's remarkable story of development as a nation, as an economy, and as a society. One of the cornerstones of Singapore's synthesis is pragmatism, focusing on what works in practice rather than in principle. So my Q&A is going to be in that tenor. And I'd like you to put on a CEO hat, not Chief Executive Officer, Chief Execution Officers, please. And please, in your responses, give us practical measures for resilience building, right? Okay, Arunabha, I'm not going to go in order. That's a bit un-Singaporean, but I'm just going to ask you the first question, which is this, that in the face of significant economic uncertainty that we're witnessing. We've got a demand shock from tariffs in Asia. We are seeing intensifying climate impacts, reconfiguration of supply chains for clean technology and materials. In the face of that, Asia and Asian economies have to make sure that they focus on energy resilience, climate resilience, and sustain growth and jobs.
Yes.
So what are your specifically two or three enabling actions that you'd recommend for Asian economies? Of course, there's no one size fits all, that you would recommend for Asia to achieve its goals while they're going through this volatile external environment.
Well, the first thing, Amita, first of all, thanks for your intervention because at the end of the day, Carl, James, and I can talk about the problems, but unless we solve what I consider is the biggest market failure in the world, the lack of sufficient insurance cover for the kind of risks we are facing, and that's why your leadership matters so much, we'll not be able to deal with it. Therefore, what's the first thing that Asian economies need to do? Internalize that Asia is the locomotive of the global economy now. Notwithstanding tariffs, challenges, notwithstanding disrupted supply chains, we are the locomotive of the global economy. If Asia sneezes, the world will catch a cold. Therefore, it's super important, even as we internalize the economic impacts of the challenges around us, that we invest in what you said right at the outset, your first P, the prepare, or what I call the hyper-local assessment of the risks we are facing. That is a no regret strategy for Asian economies or our subnational governments. We are large economies in many cases with provinces, etc. So that's number one. And investing in the technology, in the data, in getting the ground truthing from the communities, in leveraging AI for better predictive modeling, that is number one. Number two, what we have to do is focus on where the interdependencies of what is happening across the border or in a different province, etc., how it impacts you. That could be water. Carl said go from downstream to upstream. It could be atmospheric rivers. In the morning in the plenary, we heard about the importance of the biodiversity in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia. That biodiversity then impacts the moisture content that you have that then falls as precipitation in other parts of Asia. Getting that interdependency sorted, you realize that it's not just supply chains of products and services, it's actually, we're talking about a supply chain of ecosystem services. There's nothing more pragmatic than understanding our interdependence with the natural ecosystem within which we inhabit. And the third thing we got to do is bring these two things together, the risk assessment on one hand and the interaction of the economy and nature on the other hand, and price it. Now, how we price is you're pricing the risk or you're pricing the solution. That's where Asian economies, and I would particularly say China and the Far East, Japan, Korea on one side, Southeast Asia is another potential finance hub, and my part of the world, South Asia, India particularly, as a finance hub. Getting our financial ecosystems to interact helps to create a bigger market that can potentially pool the risks but lower the cost curves.
Excellent. Thanks, Arunabha. So prepare better, understand the interconnectivities, and bring it all together. Thank you so much. So, Carl, thank you for that visual treat, although I'm not sure treat is the right word. But you talked about a disorganization emergency, okay, in water resilience. But for water resilience, for water resilience, we need financing, we need business models, we need policy, we need capacity, we need capability. And so, my question to you is right now, in the absence of shared ambition, urgency, alignment that we see on water, what are your practical measures that you would recommend to which stakeholders specifically in order to provide more structure, ambition, and focus?
That's a great question. That's why I love being here because I'm so inspired with so many solutions that truly are just out of sequence, right? And the pressure that we have is a learning moment. We heard this morning that Asia is stepping up in a leadership position. Now, the pragmatic step is really to reverse engineer. Who do you want to reach and what do you want them to do? And that's what we did in China is we built in a sense a systems model. We went to the field, we captured the data, we captured the story. We dropped a pin from the sky and said, where does that land? And it landed in the coal mines in Inner Mongolia. But then if you identify the five key people that pull the levers of power,
Yeah.
and then what is the story you want to tell them in a framework that they can actually understand, and then put the solutions in the order that they can actually implement. So it's whether it's the de-risking piece, because we have financial de-risking pieces here. I heard last night, we're looking for deal flow. We have money to invest, but I can't get the deal flow in water. So how do we pragmatically line up the
Mm.
de-risking, the deal flow, and the solutions that we have? And also, the two other pieces are understanding the influencers. What's the public thinking? This is the policy, the softer part, but then also the policy makers. Oftentimes, the solutions show up and the regulations and the policy isn't cued. And so that's very practical. Build that roadmap, reverse engineer where you need to go, what you want to do, and who are the players that need to be at the room in the Apollo 13 moment.
Thank you. Thanks, Carl, for that. Okay. And James, uh, you just shared very little about the Singapore example that is, where Singapore is taking very targeted and holistic action on coastal protection. We've got people from different countries in Asia here. And would you be able to provide an action framework that other Asian economies can use based on the example that you shared for comprehensive strategies?
Yes, yes, definitely. I think first of all, I think there should be a country adaptation framework, and in Singapore, that's something that was done. In fact, our company completed the coastal protection study for the entire Singapore back in 2019, and thereafter, I think the government looked at it and actually created got PUB to take over as a coastal protection department, and that actually takes time to legislate and come up with frameworks. And that is something that beyond that, PUB has then now look at site-specific studies. They, which is similar, like what Dr. Ghosh said, go down to the local area and come up with solutions that is practical and that can be implemented. And that is something that I think a lot of our regional countries can emulate. The framework for coastal protection to look at the flood risk
Yeah.
and coming out with cost and benefit assessments. From there, then as practitioners, then we look at how to develop projects that can then look for financial investments. Yeah.
Thank you, James.
Yeah.
So it starts with risk assessment, and then you do your cost benefit, and then you decide to do solutions and sharing.
Yes,
Thank
very
you.
much that. Yeah.
So I have more questions, but there is a lot of firepower in the room. So I'm going to put up the question that's sort of got two votes so far, which is the highest number of votes. So in this question, can we put up the question from Julie? Uh, and the question is, it actually was very much aligned with the question I was going to ask you. How can we create value case for adaptation to attract more investments from the private sector?
Can I take a stab at this?
Yeah,
Yeah.
please do.
So I think which is why when I started my presentation, I said we talk about mitigation, maybe in another room, thinking that's different, and then adaptation is a separate problem. It isn't, it's linked. So, one of the things we did last year was work with the Confederation of Indian Industry, which is the largest body of the apex body of companies across the country. We leveraged our hyperlocal climate resilience atlas with where the companies were planning to make capex investments for their capacity expansion, whether it's a textile plant they were building or something else, right? Now, that capex will get impacted over the 2-3 decade period when you're expecting to recoup that investment. So if you don't have a sense of how urban flooding can shut down your plant, or how the groundwater depletion then impacts the cooling center that you need, um, you're basically shooting yourself in the foot. So the case for adaptation is really the case for business continuity. It's as simple as that. And you get that hyperlocal assessment at a district, at a sub-district, at a zonal level. That's when the boards of corporations realize this makes sense. Now, how you amortize that cost over the period of your physical investment is the financial innovation that is needed. But the case for it becomes much clearer at the board level when you realize it's about business continuity, not just about saving the planet.
Fantastic. So the case for business continuity needs to be made, and it seems to me that mapping, which was what Mr. Menon also talked about,
Yes.
mapping of risk and doing more research in that is going to be absolutely critical. So the next question with the highest number of votes is, in terms of building resilience, what is your view on the use of nuclear power? The fear of nuclear hazards overshadowed the benefits, or it lacks merit on CBA and lacks research. Anyone? Not sure it's the right question. So the highest number. Maybe the next one then. I think, Carl, this is for you. What are the most overlooked water-related risks in urban industrial planning? How can early warning systems or data analytics address them? Thank you.
That's a great question. So the early warning, I mean, we have the data, we need to be putting it in context. And so the overlooked risk is truly this intersection, this nexus. We tend to silo and talk about water, and we talk about food, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about mobility, but we're not talking about systems. So I think the overlooked piece is that systems piece. So when investors say, well, what should I invest in water? I want to invest in water. Well, you have to look at water as a system. So I always say invest around the edges, right? I mentioned Mexico City. Let's not let Mexico City or the other day zeros become a threat. Let's turn those into a forcing moment and opportunity. And let's talk about these pieces that actually can align. We're talking about rebuilding the infrastructure, identifying the leaks in the system, pulling forward the innovators that actually know how to remotely say at least fix and patch leaky pipes. 40% of the water in Mexico City leaks before it even gets to
Wow.
the users. So you're building resilient systems upstream and doing restoration and forest restoration and watershed restoration only to leak that water back out before it even gets to the city. And so I think it's back to that systems piece. And also I want to come back to China for a second, because one of the risks too is we come up with the solutions and it's not queued with the mayor or the other leaders in the communities. What we learned in Mexico, in China, was with the water minister, we gave him standing with the other ministers. He'd been at the children's table, metaphorically, so to speak, but once he had the data, once he had the story to tell, he could go to the infrastructure minister and say, if you want to fill the canal, you talk to me. If you want to cool the power plant, energy minister, you need to talk to me. So it's building that agency so that flywheel can start to spin. The biggest risk is that we don't connect the dots in the right order.
Thank you, Carl. So we do need to connect the dots. And I think we're on time. We've got 20 seconds left. So as closing remarks, if there's in one phrase or one word you'd like to sort of just give me your takeaway from the discussion or generally on resilience, you'd like to go first.
Maybe I'll just say that it's important for solutions provider to generate real solutions that has got value that can have investors look at it. So not just purely looking at an adaptation, but putting in a layer where there can be economic returns and hence be able to attract more investors to help with this adaptation. Yeah.
Thank you, James. Arunabha.
My one word is, or one phrase is pool the risks. You talked a lot, Amita, on your 4P framework on preparing and providing for the insurance cover. Now, the problem is that if you take Philippines and you try and do parametric insurance just for the Philippines, it's going to become uneconomical because you're going to keep getting hit by the same typhoon. Typhoon in one place, and drought in another place, and crop failure in a third place, and urban flooding in the fourth place. We, let's finger cross that all of that does not happen all at the same time. I think geographically pooling our risks from a changing climate might be one way to solve for this market failure where we are not
Yes.
in smaller geographies not managing to cover for the vulnerability that we are assessing.
Fantastic. God.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too. David Attenborough says that saving the planet is a communications challenge. So I think we have to remember we talk about being local and super local. Who's at the tip of the spear? That's a story that captures hearts. We back that with the data. Then we actually have a chance to really change the course and actually build, instead of one person, build 8 billion people behind us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carl, Arunabha, and James, for this great insights.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for listening.